Welcome to Hort Culture, where a group of extension professionals and plant people talk about the business, production, and joy of planting seeds and helping them grow. Join us as we explore the culture of horticulture. I'm not going to lie, I don't get sick of hearing myself say the intro. Welcome, everybody, to Hort Culture. I'm so impressed I can sound so, professional.
It's very alluring.
Oh, yes. Welcome to Hort Culture.
Inviting. I feel invited into your culture.
How's everybody doing today? How's everybody feeling? I made a lot of hand gestures right now. Nobody just saw that. But
we're going to have to do a video just so we capture all of this extra goodness.
We're on it, a lot of goodness. Y'all. We're on it.
Built-in ASMR.
So yes, I have a question for you, Alexis.
Is it a good question or a stupid question?
Down to brass tacks.
It's a dumb question.
Of course.
Well, it could be a dumb question. Could you, what is the distinct that you've got interplanting, companion planting, permaculture guilds? Are these the same thing? Are these different things?
I would throw in living mulch.
You would.
You.
That's just a euphemism for weeds, Brett. We're not judging your weedy garden. You can call it living mulch if you want. That's fine.
Living mulch till I go in with the Roundup.
That's it. The non-selective broad spectrum.
Well, so kind of yes and no. I think the basic action of all of them are pretty much the same, but the way we think about those plants, at least in my brain, is a little bit different.
Interplanting, companion planting.
Yeah. And
those are the two that I really have to think about.
Concept and permaculture, which might be more perennial kind of focused.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We should do some permaculture episodes.
Oh yeah, that would be fun. And I think a lot of the things we talk about are all permaculture basics, but like thinking of bringing all of these together into one permaculture episode, would be neat. So yeah, I think if we feel like kind of thinking about interplanting versus companion planting, Ray, jump in here. But the way I think of interplanting is more spatial. So using interplanting as a way to maximize your space by putting as many crops in there as you can, as well as keeping an area, a space like weed free is kind of how I think about interplanting versus companion planting is more how do those plants mutually benefit each other as far as like is there nitrogen fixation, we think about the three sisters of beans, corns, and pumpkins or melons or whatever growing together using each other as a structure, right? And or even repelling insects. You always hear about marigolds, which I have a whole thing about marigolds, but trap cropping. So it's kind of to me, when I speak about them and the way, the social aspect, the culture of horticulture, so to speak, is that companion planting is more about the mutually beneficial versus interplanting. They don't necessarily help each other in either way, but they don't hurt each other either, and we're putting them all into one space together. Does that feel okay to everybody else?
Sure.
Yeah, and our discussion today, I was trying to think of the scale of our discussion because so much of what we do involves like big and little scales and medium scales. Probably when we have a discussion on both companion planting and everything else along with that, intercropping, some of that may be more common on a smaller scale in smaller spaces, but that's not to say that on a medium and large scale that you don't see some of the same concepts of interplanting and specifically companion planting. I see that on a little bit larger commercial scale every now and again, but more often I see that on a small scale. Do you guys observe that too, like in smaller spaces?
I think it depends on the nature of it. So could I clarify real quick or ask? So you gave examples, the three sisters and the marigolds and tomatoes. You were saying those were examples of companion planting. Is that right?
Right.
So can you give me some, like, not necessarily crop pairings, but just examples of what interplanting might look like species wise?
So interplanting would be, remember, we're thinking more spatially about this. So cramming as many plants as we can into a space just so we get more out of that space and or for weed control in that space. So One really good one is like lettuce, like a leaf lettuce, underneath your tomato. So you plant your tomato down the middle of the row, and on either side of that tomato, we plant a shallow rooted lettuce early in the season that is done by the time that tomato comes out and shades out that planting. For a weed pressure one I'm personally looking into is using radishes, which are a root crop. They're very fast growing, and intermixing them with a very slow growing crop. And so you're covering the soil with something that's easy to take out. Maybe you do sell that, or maybe you just use it almost like a cover crop. But you can pull that out. You can probably get a couple successions of it, and you're keeping weeds from building up until those slow growing plants have filled in that canopy to prevent weed pressure.
Gotcha. So in that case, you're using that slower or that faster thing to cover the
Mm-hmm.
soil so that you don't have to weed in between. So if I'm imagining my garden
Mm-hmm.
and I've got tomato plants and everywhere around it is completely bare ground, if I wanted to interplant, I would think about coming in and putting something else down that's going to
Mm-hmm.
also be growing right next to it. So I'm not going to
Right.
have all my tomato plants out there by themselves. I'm going to have other stuff planted right up against it or in the
Mm-hmm.
rows in between or wherever. Is that kind of what you're?
Yeah, something that's not
Gotcha.
going to damage it. You're not going to, have trouble harvesting. You're essentially it's a way to think of time, kind of time and space. Yeah, time in that aspect of maybe you're harvesting before your other crop comes into, fruition or whatever.
So is there a difference here from cover cropping?
So cover cropping is usually, Ray, please jump in. But cover cropping is usually like something that we could be using it for weed pressure, but we're not putting our crop in with it
Yeah.
typically. So it's
It
something
could be
more
a smother crop or just for like organic amendment, like to increase your soil organic
right. We're
matter or
incorporating it and then
stabilization. Yeah.
right, and then coming in with our main crop. They're not happening at the same time in the same
Mhm.
space, I should say. So sometimes people will put like a clover in their alleyways between their tomato rows because it's easier to walk in. And clover also is a nitrogen fixer, so in theory it becomes more available to those tomatoes. But those tomatoes themselves are in plastic, and so that's not exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about plants sharing the same space with interplanting.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I think it's something that where it's like right on the boundary I was thinking of is somebody who plants a cover crop and then does like a crimping sort of thing and
Mm-hmm.
uses that mostly done plant as like a
Mm-hmm.
mulch to plant in.
Living mulch. Yeah.
Right, right. It's like in that boundary. Like a lot of these things, there's these edge cases where it's all a Venn diagram and sometimes you get something that's kind of a little bit of both.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Let's
because I'm
face it, Josh, horticulture is an edge case here in Kentucky. And
Indeed.
that's what we're all
We an
about.
edge.
We
li-
find
Living on the edge.
excellence in being unique. Okay. That's where we're at. But yeah,
Living
that's a
on
good point,
the
well,
Josh.
because I think that kind of practice is done at a very large scale.
edge. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
have seen 3,000 acres of watermelon pumpkins planted into a crimped rye or wheat cover
Mhm.
crop. And I mean, in principle, we have terms to differentiate things, but in general, we're trying to keep the soil covered, reduce erosion loss, improve,
Water
soil organic
movement,
matter.
organic matter. Yep.
But we're also in trying to keep that soil cool in some cases too.
Mhm.
But in this case, we're doing it all at the same time, and they're both living side by side. Is that
Yeah, so
right?
half the battle of this discussion, you all, is just clarifying. And, we sometimes throw these terms in together, but I'm glad you guys are differentiating out the terms because interplanting, companion planting, living mulches, all of this, sort of ties in together, but they have their own unique little caveats. And it really boils down to, well, what's your objectives for undertaking these things? And that's, the rest will take care of itself is based on your objectives. And I like to stress, particularly with like, not to pick on companion planting, but there's lots of information online about different methods, different plants and companion plantings, and doing things like either attracting beneficial insects or repelling the not so desirable insects. But that doesn't take the place of scouting. And even if you do a good job setting up your companion planting, that may not take care of all of your issues in any given year, because I find that with companion planting and concepts like that it's highly variable. It just varies a great deal from person to person. They do little things that they might not even understand they're doing, or it definitely varies from area to area and year to year based on pest pressure and weather. Depends on how well something like companion planting works, and the goals, the reason that you're doing that practice. And there's lots of different practices, lots of different reasons you would do those practices.
Can we tease out the insect repellent for companion planting, as like using companion planting as insect repellent is a burr in my butt. Um, so
Oh, here we go.
I get this question
Sorry
a
to hear
lot.
that.
Here's the
And
edge
I know
case.
It's
there's
terrible.
probably
My
at least a
condolences.
couple
Huckleberry.
people listening that are like are ready to shut this off because I said that,
Uh-oh.
because they might use it and it works for them and that's great. But I think of it less as a repellent, like planting a marigold next to, my cabbage plant for cabbage loopers. I don't think of the marigold as repelling that cabbage looper, and it sees that marigold and goes oop, and it turns around and flies away. I think of it more as a trap crop. And so I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just thinking reframe your brain around how this
Be
works.
realistic about your expectations.
Trap crop.
So
Trap crop. Can
trap
you
crop, yeah.
expand on that for me?
That's like a
Yes.
trap
So
house, right?
Yeah.
Or that's
yeah,
different.
sort of.
Like the
So
drum tracks? Traps?
She's going to start talking about nasturtiums, I guarantee. Here we go.
well, nasturtiums are up there. I was actually going to talk about bell peppers and sunflowers.
Okay,
Mm.
go off.
So this is something that we see in both large and small operations, and I'm bringing this up because it was a recent research project at UK in the entomology department. So you have all your bell peppers in a plot, right? A square of bell peppers, and what they did was a few feet out from that, enough to get, their implements through or whatever it is. So it might be 20 feet, whatever. They planted a box of sunflowers around that. And the purpose was, so stink bugs are a really big problem for bell peppers. Stink bugs love them some sunflowers a lot more than bell peppers. So it's like, trying to tell a 2-year-old that, to eat the broccoli instead of eating the chicken nugget, right? They're going to eat the chicken nugget first. So the stink bugs then go to the sunflowers, and they'll stay in the sunflowers, and sometimes depending on the timing, you don't have to do anything. They'll stay with the sunflowers long enough for you to get your crop out of the field, those bell peppers out. But a lot of time we use them as a trap crop in the way that we're going to spray that trap crop. And so we only are hitting the sunflowers, which are not a crop that we're giving for, human consumption. And I say spray, it can be any spray, it can be an oil, it can be organic, whatever it is. We're only treating that small amount, not having to treat our actual products. We don't have to worry about harvest times, anything like that. And then, you don't have to worry. There's just so many things. So think of it more as that marigold is going to attract that. I use them with Japanese beetles. So Japanese beetles love marigolds. So I'm going to pull the Japanese beetles away from my other crops to the marigolds. I'm going to keep them in the marigolds. I know to go there to kill them. And I'm going to take the pressure off of my other crops, which maybe couldn't take those Japanese beetles as well as a marigold would. So when I think about companion planting, I think of them as a trap crop and a lot less as a repellent, because when it comes down to it, there's tons of smells out there. Like, they're gonna go around that marigold. They don't care,
So you're telling me that stink bugs and Instagram influencers both drawn to fields of sunflowers.
Essentially, they're the same thing.
I see.
Mm-hmm.
So in that case, the thinking about the marigold and the tomato is that the marigold is going to draw the whatever the bugs are away from the tomatoes.
Mm-hmm.
But if you just put a marigold right next to the tomato, it's going to eat the marigolds and then move on and eat the tomatoes.
Right. And so sometimes these companion plants are used. We haven't talked about indicator plants, which is sort of the same thing. But so indicator plants, people will use these in greenhouses. They use them outside. Like I said, I use marigolds for this because I know they're the number one food source for whatever problem I have. So Japanese beetles are a good one because everybody has a big issue with those. And so I know that I'm going to start scouting my marigolds. Remember, we're scouting still for those Japanese beetles. And so if I need to do any type of prevention, like if I'm going to net my cabbage or my broccoli, I know to net them before I have a problem because my indicator plant has told me that, these insects are here and it's time to do control measures on the valuable crops. So that's another kind of form of companion planting, is using one or two plants in a larger area as your indicators. Thoughts? Sorry, that's the burr that I get because I get a lot of questions on that.
Yeah, the
And
trap crop stuff. I mean, like as you're saying, it's a sometimes, and I'm not folk wisdom has a lot to offer and it's highly valuable,
agreed.
but in some cases, the companion planning stuff can kind of veer into the magical thinking side of how we're approaching this stuff, and so having a little bit of a healthy respect for that, but at the same time, the trap crop stuff. I mean, it's validated. It is there is research out there about it, and if you look up different trap crops for different types of things that you're growing. I know that like blue Hubbards, for instance, are really susceptible and highly attractive to I think squash vine borers and maybe some other stuff too. And so that's a typical one that you'll see sometimes. And you'll also have there's a whole other realm here of co-planting where you think about building habitat for beneficial insects that eat the insects that are problems on your crops. That's a whole other thing that's separate from this and maybe a different conversation at some point in the future. But so in general, though, you're talking about a companion plant is often referred to, or is a trap crop that's often referred to as a companion plant, and with it on the insect side. That's good. I
Another
hadn't thought of it that way.
Another kind of a addition to this discussion is that this concept of monocultures and the fact that the way insects find crops, both by sight and smell, and it doesn't take much to confuse that. And it's this whole concept of ground level complexity, simply meaning a variety of crops thrown in together and non-related crops intermingled is harder for insects to key in on than one large monoculture. And that's just an emerging field of research. Is pretty interesting, and there's a lot to that. And even years ago, I think I may, and it was just a personal observation, this is not research, but we had like a quarter acre of green beans or something that was off to the side of one of our fields, and we got busy with cattle and tobacco and other enterprises on the farm, and we did not have time to take care of these field of beans. And we always had a heavy insect pressure in this area, and it was either Johnson grass or cocker burrs, if I can pronounce that. Alexis,
that is
that
the
goes back
burr.
to your burr.
Cocklebur.
But a lot of weeds grew up in this bean field, and it was the best beans that we had ever grown. And we were like, what in the world? We had no insect pressure for 2 years in a row. Weather and things let us off. We planted the beans, could not take care of them properly. And then when we went back to having perfectly clean fields, now this is anecdotal, but we talked to the extension agent at the time, my father did years ago, and he discussed these same concepts that we're talking about now. And he thought it may have had something to do with just target confusion of the insects that were a problem at the time. But there's a lot of research that confirms that, is that these large monocultures, just the opportunity to have a pest come in and do some major damage is increased when you just have a large planting of one thing.
It's like an olfactory camouflage.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a texture. It's a visual camouflage. It's both, is what they're finding, depending on the insect. So there's something to that too. And I think people benefit from that sometimes. If nothing else, it's just that there's a bunch of different crops in the same area, so it's harder to key in on. So that may be something too. That's kind of related concept to what you guys are talking about.
It's that real tree green bean pattern.
That's it. We may need to patent that, the camo bean.
Camo
The
bean.
camo bean.
Yeah,
It's a new thing, guys.
We'll have Mossy Oak and Real Tree in a bidding war over
And we will sell like weed seeds to go along with it to camouflage it.
We'll make that.
It's the camo kit.
We do the full on hunting channel where like we're in a tree stand, like whispering to each other, just watching the bugs not eat or eat the field.
Watching the beetles just get confused.
We're down.
Bonus points if you can.
Now.
Yes.
Bonus points if it's like something deer eat, and it's, they're eating the camo bean.
Yeah.
So,
and we've caused one problem and solved another.
Let's shut the podcast down and get started on product development.
What are we doing with our lives
right now?
So another way companion planting can be used is through nitrogen fixation. So using legumes to fix that nitrogen for your ideal crop. So that's something that people will do with,
Could you give me a
beans.
couple of legumes? What are we talking? What is a legume? What are some
So,
examples?
pretty much any of your beans, there are legumes that don't fix nitrogen. So, like redbud trees are a legume, right? They create a bean pod. If you ever seen anything that produces something that looks like a bean pod, is in the legume family. So, peas, beans, alfalfa is in the is it all a legume or is it just a
It
nitrogen
is.
fixer? It's
It's
a legume.
nitrogen fixer. Yeah.
I don't really actually know what the seed of alfalfa looks like. So, horticulture over here. But yeah, so anything that's going to produce like a
Clover,
bean.
Clover, yeah.
Yeah, clover is another good one.
peas, Austrian winter peas in terms of
Mm-hmm.
cover crops. I just sometimes
Vet
people are
is
jumping.
vetch. I feel like vetch might be. I don't know.
I think vetch is.
I think vetch is.
Yeah.
Josh is our behind the scenes researcher.
I think is
But
Yeah.
a
is
lot of
black
people.
locust technically a
Yes,
legume?
it is. Hairy vetch is
I
a
think it
Mhm.
legume.
is. Black locust is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway,
So
it's that kind of bean and pea and lentil
Yeah.
vibe of
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
And
So
that's one of the classic examples we always give is you get that secondary benefit of the nitrogen fixation there.
mhm.
I
bringing
think
in good
Lespedeza.
microbes, things like that. A lot
Mhm.
of people use these legumes as cover crops. Those are incorporated into the soil, and then you're putting your stuff in later. But you can use them interplanted again. We go back to the three sisters, which we should just do a whole episode on those because I have learned so much more about them and how we've essentially
My mom
downplayed
was
all of
my
that.
mom always did that system, even though it was a pain for me. And we didn't do it on the production side, did it on the large home garden side. But she did that every year because that's what her family did. And she loved it.
Mm-hmm.
And it worked well together. It was sort of it had one kind of helped the other kind of thing. And it was neat. And she always did that. She used that system. And that's how she grew beans, corn, and then used the broad leaves of a cucurbit, usually pumpkins, to shade the ground. But yeah, she did that all the time, and I just thought it was a big hot mess. My dad and I are like, "Oh, we like monocultures. What is
We like
this?
straight
This you how are
lines.
we supposed to till this?" My mom's
This
like,
is
"That's the
not
point.
organized.
Tack
Yeah.
it. You don't have to till it because it shades itself." Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a neat system. So you've done a lot of research on that, Alexis. That
Well, I haven't say a lot. I just have
the reading.
been like hearing a lot more, reading, hearing, whatever, on how
Mm-hmm.
essentially we've just downplayed that entire system, and there was so much more to it, and all the microbes, the science behind it, and just
Mm-hmm.
how we are like, oh, it's the corn, bean, and
Well,
pumpkin, and
we
it was
talked
more
about
than that.
soil in a previous podcast, and we talked about how do we create healthy soil, and the crops like the Three Sisters system is a good example of that, where beans and corn take nutrients from different levels. Not only that, but their roots penetrate the soil differently, and they have different microbes that are associated with those crops, and it adds to soil diversity. And all of these things are pretty deep dives into soil benefits,
Mm-hmm.
all of those things. And I read something somewheres that talked about like one of the best reasons to grow a tap-rooted crop with a fibrous rooted crop is that the tap-rooted crop would go down deeper,
Mm-hmm.
grab nutrients where the fibrous rooted crops could not get to. They would bring it up into their plant tissue, then decay, go on the ground, and then make that available at a more shallow depth. And I thought that was really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And that's assuming that you're leaving the biomass intact. You're leaving it there for the tap-rooted crops, such as a cover crop. And I thought that was interesting. It was literally grabbing, some of these crops were grabbing deep level nutrients that other crops could not grab onto, bringing it up to the top of the soil surface, and then kind of degrading back down into the soil and becoming available. It was pretty neat.
Look at Ray just naturally moving us into interplanting.
Moving on.
Well, and so you brought it in so beautifully, just thinking about root systems. So when you think about interplanting, these crops we're putting right up next to each other. So you don't want to plant a fibrous root next to a fibrous root because they're going to compete. So you want to put in, a root crop. You also want to think about speed of the crop. So I brought up radishes earlier. Radishes finish in like 30 days or something like that. So if you put that in with a crop that maybe has 100 days, before it's going to fruit, that those days to maturity, then you can get a lot of radish crop out of there, which means you're preventing weeds from building up while that slower 100-day crop is coming in. You're getting more out of that, and you're not competing with your long day crop. And so you got to really think about kind of that root system. Sunflowers are not a great, we talk about them as they're a great trap crop. They're not really a great interplanting crop because they are, not only are they they're fast, which usually would be a good thing, but they're also very, very fibrous. They take a lot of nutrients very quickly. They're relatively high feeders as far as they're going to soak up nutrients a lot faster than some of your other crops will. They're just going to scavenge for it and find it before something else will. So it's not the best for interplanting, but it can be used on those outskirts as a companion.
So are there classic intercropping combinations or uses, or like I'm looking to choose from this list of slow growers and slow and low grow or fast and low growers, and or is it kind of a choose your own adventure, pairing things and figuring
When
things
I'm
out?
working with home gardeners, I encourage them, first of all, of course, is to, put in keywords if they're going to do a general search, cooperative extension service, and then put in keywords such as compatible companion plants garden. Because there are lots of good. Now, this is where my memory fails me, and I have to go back to charts, even after doing it for several years. But there's a lot of good charts out there that are pretty well, researched about crops that work well with each other, both as intercrops and as companion crops. And I just basically I've got 3 or 4 of my favorite charts that I use, but I'd encourage listeners to go do that. You don't have to memorize it if you can go look it up. So go look it up. Extension Service Companion Plant Chart Home Gardens, something like that, keywords like that. And there's definitely great charts out there that detail some of the ways that you can mix and match these crops. And Alexis has already touched on some of those factors you need to consider, such as timing, growth height. You don't want, competition for sunlight or anything like that. And crops that can benefit from an understory shading. All of those considerations are in nice charts, and they're not too terribly hard to find.
I would say you could probably generalize your leafy greens because they're usually pretty shallow rooted, pretty quick. They don't take up a lot of space, right? They're only a foot tall, sometimes around
So you're
there.
saying like kales, lettuces.
Kales, lettuces, yeah, leaf lettuce especially. I would say away from your head lettuces though, just because they're going to get large. They take a lot more time in there. But your leaf lettuces, your kales, spinach, stuff like that, and then a lot of your root crops will be fine. So carrots, I've said radishes 100 times because they're on my brain. I need to go buy some. But carrots, radishes, some of your alliums. So allium family is going to be your onions, garlic. If you're growing flowers, there are allium drumstick alliums, things like that. Now those do in a sense can repel. I know some people who use them on the edges of their high tunnels for voles and things like that because there's that onion smell above ground and underground, and so they'll actually use them as kind of a deterrent, almost like a natural fence. And in that case, we do have some research that says that that's pretty effective. So if you have vole or mole trouble in an area, try maybe planting something alien. Put your garlic on the outside, onions, whatever.
I've successfully used it to ward off vampires myself.
I mean,
Nice.
you're
Yeah,
still
I've
with
never
us,
seen
so
any vampires.
I've never been attacked.
You're here.
I
Yeah.
mean, here we are. I'm Italian, so it's just garlic runs in my veins.
Oh, madon.
Yeah. But
Steer clear.
and then your legumes where you can do something tall. So, you can put your beans, your pole beans down the middle and then something short on the outside like your lettuce, or if you put your peas are a great one. So peas are early season and your lettuce likes it cold too, and your spinach. So you put your peas down the middle of the bed, and then right outside those peas you can do your spinach and your lettuce, and then you're getting 2 crops in the same bed space that you would normally only have one. So I
Now,
would
wait
say
a
those
minute.
are
I
what.
want to be the wet blanket here.
Yeah, I know, with the
Oh,
aliens
I
and the
really
blah blah
want to,
blah.
because we have to acknowledge the bear in the room, and he's 500 pounds and he's angry.
And he's a
But before you go
Jeez, Ray,
all in,
I know COVID was rough on me, but let's
I know, Brett, I was not looking at you. I was looking at the Zoom camera. It's coincidental that I was staring directly into your eyes deeply, Brett. I'm so sorry.
bear in the room.
I'm busted. But before you go all in on any of these intensive, and I stress the word intensive, gardening techniques where you're putting a bunch of plants really close together, think about the general concept of what you're doing. You do have to really be careful, even though most of these things that, especially the ones Alexis just mentioned, are going to work well together. But think about, you're affecting things like relative humidity and in some cases disease transmission. So the only thing that I would tell home gardeners, and I've worked with some gardeners that would, that had just a little bit of gardening experience, and they went all in on this system and did not have a good time of it for one reason or another.
It was not
And
a
a
good
lot of it
time.
had to do with like molds and mildews and funguses that really, because the plants were so close together, they didn't manage sunlight properly or didn't manage airflow properly. So those are things to consider
You're
too.
right. And not everything plays well
Alexis
together.
conceded. She goes, okay, okay.
Fine. I'm just like all about smashing stuff together, just as
Yeah,
much
well,
as I can get out of an area.
Sandwiches, I mean, hoagies, that's my sandwich,
BLT,
man. Just
baby.
smash it together. Yeah.
and Alexis also, in addition to having a lot of experience,
Yes. Yeah.
growing stuff,
Yeah.
is also, I think, a natural, very good grower, very attentive to plants in
Thank you.
general.
Ugh.
And so for her, she's dreaming of all the possibilities. But keeping in mind that we are talking to some beginners and some folks who aren't used to reading stuff and
Yeah.
seeing and kind
Yeah.
of having a sense of how that might work. I think that's a great point, Ray.
And
Yeah.
one from timeline wise, so we talked about, I feel like we haven't hit time, and I have a really good example of that. Sorry, I'm just very excited about interplanting. Timeline. So daffodils, right? Daffodils come up early. If you they come up before everything else. So you can put them in beds with other things that will come up later. So an example is yarrow. I don't know if people are familiar with yarrow, but a lot of your perennial crops or annuals, it could be annuals too, but a lot of perennials because, you're not digging around in the bulbs. You can plant daffodils in there. They come up, they flower, you harvest, you let them be pretty, whatever. And then you get this growth of the yarrow or this other perennial crop. And so it's starting to flourish when the daffodils are naturally dying. So you hit that timeline where, again, you can have two crops in one bed. One is a bulb, one is a fibrous root system, and they play well together. So that's another way. I've started doing that, and that's very exciting for me to be able to fit more into that bed without hurting anything. And like Ray was saying, like that, those mildews, those insect, like a lot of that can come into play, but because these are thriving at completely different times, I don't have to worry about their close spacing down in there.
Yeah, and I think one of the things too is that the you don't have to go wholesale into the doing every bed this way.
Yeah.
You can, just like with most other things, you can try one row that way and see if your weeding is reduced considerably and see if your the yield is better, or see if the insect pressure is lower, or whatever it may be. You don't have to, and I would say if you're doing this commercially on and you're trying to integrate this, I would
Experiment.
advise that you do that to just see if one row works well before you jump in. And if that whole row gets taken out and then you look up and find that daffodils are a vector for a disease that affects a certain crop that you grew, then
Yeah.
you've lost that row, and that's no big deal. But yeah, it did in general
These
a little bit
concepts are
of
great. I
yeah.
love these concepts of, and you're getting into pretty high level science when you involve yourself in these things, because you're blending so many concepts together, and it's just really cool. And I think it's one of those things, if you kind of incrementally kind of dip your toes in and then dive all the way in, when you're ready to do that, it's so cool how much you can do with smaller spaces. And we've talked a lot about production on some of the other podcasts, and getting the most out of your space, especially folks that have things like high tunnels where you need to make those things productive. And I imagine, people are probably looking for ways to make them more productive, and maybe they can apply some of these concepts we're talking about today to get that extra productivity out of there by intercropping, companion planting, and get some of the secondary benefits maybe from those things as well.
And just a
Alexis,
side
where are
note.
you?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say this can be done for agroforestry as well. So interplanting, it's a much different scale, obviously, because you're going to give a tree a lot more room than you would give, a tomato plant. But this is something that can be used from the home garden scale all the way up to, fruit trees, nuts, those types of things. So sorry. Anyways, I'm so excited.
So when you get excited about interplanting, where have you gone to find out more information or learn about stuff, or like where have you seen examples, come across examples? Because you have this knowledge that you've amassed over time. I'm just curious if you have thoughts on where people might go to learn
So
more.
I would say the starters, there's always some starter information. So our UK pub, home gardening, which of course, anything usually home gardening can be used on a large scale as well. But our ID 128, which is home gardening in Kentucky, has that kind of short little list about that. But honestly, a lot of the stuff that I've been talking about today and have tried to implement because it makes sense in my brain is I've just heard from other farmers. So other farmers who have been doing it a lot longer, and they're like, a lot of them are on a really small scale, and they just said, you know what's the worst that can happen? I'm going to plant a few of these in here, and if they don't work, I'll pull it out. And if it does work, but then it's great. And so that's where I've heard that it's just other farmers, and that's why I think it's cool to bring this to you all this way, because not everybody knows another farmer that they can reach out to. But it is kind of a new, it's not a new idea at all, but it's like we're now putting it down on paper.
Yeah,
trying to find the science and why it works.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, based on in my life, I've been lucky enough to travel a decent amount, and I would say a lot of non-Western, or more accurately, maybe non-Eurocentric approaches to growing things do what we would call intercropping. They don't really, they just kind of do that.
It's just the way it's done. Yeah.
You just call it cropping.
Yeah,
it's called cropping.
It's called growing with us. The podcast, or no, that's the podcast.
Grow with us.
And so, I mean, that definitely is, as you say, it's not a new thing. Calling it intercropping and having charts and tables for it in this particular way is newer, maybe. But so I was just curious where you had found stuff out, and it sounds like that network of producers is a good place to find that out.
I heard it on a podcast, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
A farmer podcast.
I found a decent resource in the lead up to this episode that was it's from West Virginia Extension, and it's focused mostly on kind of insect management pairings. So this is more the companion planting as opposed to the intercropping, but it has a good list of kind of horticultural crops, what you're trying to plant, and then good companions, and also not good, what not to plant next to for that. There are some extension on some of these topics. There's another one that we can probably add in as a link from Tennessee that kind of talks more about intercropping and kind of what are the important aspects of intercropping, which it lists. There's 4, right? There's the spatial arrangement, how it's laid out, the density, the maturity date, so you get the timing kind of angle, and the plant architecture, as they call it. So root versus vining, that sort of a thing.
And somewheres I'll have to look it up. I forget exactly which extension university has this publication, but it's always been really good for me. And it talks about companion planting, but it approaches it from they only review practices that are backed up by research trials. And it's really interesting. They refute some things, but they confirm other things. But it's interesting in that it's all vetted, through the kind of the scientific process. And it's a really good review. It's basically a review of literature. And that's what makes it so interesting to me, because companion planting particularly involves a lot of knowledge that's been passed down, which is wonderful. But it kind of works within that realm of why does this work if it works, and it confirms it through research trials. And I'll try to put that in the show notes, the podcast description. I'll try to include that as well. But it's a really interesting, quick read, about 3 or 4 pages. But it talks about the more common scenarios that work and why they work and which research supports that. It's really good.
If you have questions about interplanting, you can ask us through our Instagram at Hort Culture Podcast. You can direct message through there or grab one of our emails. One of our emails will be in the show notes as well. So if you've got some specific questions, I mean, this is what we do is we help people answer very broad, very specific questions. And we'd be happy if you're just like, I was thinking about throwing these 2 things together. We can give you our experience if we have any, or hash through why or what problems you might face growing those two things together. So,
well, I'll take a crack at summing this up here. What do you think?
okay.
So I think one of the things that we did was we introduced and we differentiated between companion planting and interplanting. They're a spectrum, but I think of companion planting as sort of like teammates. They're working together, helping each other out. Interplanting feels a little bit more like roommates who get along really well. They're sharing space. They're doing different things. They're maybe complementary, but they're not directly helping each other. They're just taking up
They're
the
just
same
not in each
space.
other's way.
They're not in each other's way,
I love that.
In fact, they're complementary. You know, they're somebody does the dishes, somebody cleans the bathroom, and everything's good. So the advantages to doing either of these might be some variation on pest control, disease management. It might be covering the soil surface to keep things cool or to keep weeds down to reduce the weeding need for weeds. It could just be fitting more stuff into a smaller space if you're an intensive grower of some sort. But in general, there can be these complementary relationships between plants. And if we compare them together based on their strengths and weaknesses, we may be able to, especially in intensive systems, home gardening systems or small scale commercial systems, get more by doing better by the soil and by the environment that we're growing in. So does that sum us up pretty good?
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Perfect.
Well, again, if you want to hear more about this kind of topic, Alexis plugged the Instagram and the email, but really please do reach out to us. We love hearing from you. Even if you just say I listened and enjoy it, we really, really love hearing from you. Again, we're trying to decide what the listener group is going to be called. We threw out True Leaves last time, which sounds very cultish as I reflect on it now.
How'd you think about it?
It's like we're all gonna have the matching hoodies or something. I don't know. That seems a little over the line.
I'll
but
bring the
Are you
candles.
our plant
We
peeps?
don't
I always
have
just call
merch
them people
set
my
up,
plant
so-
peeps.
Plant peeps.
But
I like
plant
that.
peeps.
So yeah, let us know what you want to be called, and or if you just like most horticultural topics, you just defy categorization. Let us know
we
that
love
too.
it. We're just going to change it a
Yeah.
lot. So,
But yeah, thanks very much for all the support. It means a whole lot, and we look forward to hearing from you soon.
all right. Well, we will catch up with you next week as we grow this podcast. We hope you grow with us, and so join us next time. Have a great one.